One. We're on. Well, good evening. This is Joe Firestone for Real Progressives. And tonight, my special guest is Victor Tiffany, who's the director of the Contract for American Renewal campaign. Okay, and this is an effort to hold congressional candidates accountable by committing them to a contract before they get into to office. So now I'm going to turn it over to Victor to tell us about his campaign and the background and the context of the effort and the main things that he is trying to do. So Victor, I'm not even sure you're showing or that I was showing either. I forgot to push the show button, but here we are. Okay, I'm sure we're online now, and I think our audience will tell us.
Well, if they couldn't see us, they probably heard you anyway, introduce me. Thanks for having me, Joe. I appreciate this opportunity to explain what it is we're doing. I'll begin with the context. The organization I co-founded, Revolt Against Plutocracy, was the group behind the Bernie or Bust effort in 2016. We basically had three parts to that. It was Bernie, of course, the easy part. He ran for president, and then we had the pledge that voters would take. It was a voter pledge strategy. They pledged that if he's not the nominee, well, then they're going to write in his name anyway. At least that's the way it was for 6 months until we found out how many problems there were across the nation with write-in strategies. They're not counted, or they're just not on the ballot. So in January of 2016, we added the option to vote for the Green Party candidate, which is it should have been Bernie or Green 2016 all along. We didn't research it. We just ran with what we thought was a good idea. At any rate, so that was the strategy. It was activist, it was Bernie, and it was the pledge. It was voters pledging to commit to one of those two options. And the activists were the people going out and finding people to make this pledge, to take this pledge for us. So it had three components. The current strategy we could almost think of as Bernie's agenda or bust, except it's not. While most of the contents of the Contract for American Renewal came from his website, some of it is not, and therefore we're not going to use that phrase. We came up with something a little more creative. The Contract for American Renewal has a great acronym, CFAR, which evokes, somebody who's visionary. They can see into the future, and one of the policy positions, one of the 11 policy positions in the CFAR template, has to do with getting a handle on climate change, taking bold measures to address climate change, and therefore, that's visionary in terms of the future. And another one of the policy positions on the contract is to pull out of Afghanistan. So it's CFAR all the way far across the other side of the world, where the United States is bogged down into an endless war for resources. Apparently, Trump was going to pull out, if you recall. That was one of his promises, is to pull out of Afghanistan.
I do recall, indeed. And
he changed his mind because somebody let him know that there's $1 trillion worth of minerals in the mountains over there. So the deep state, of course, is still running the country. So that's basically the substitute for Bernie. It is the Contract for American Renewal, and it has, as I said, 11 policy positions, and it also has a voter pledge to it. It has people pledging to only support candidates who signed the Contract for American Renewal. So that's what it has in common with Bernie or Bust. It is a voter pledge movement. In fact, people are going to think of this as a candidates movement or a candidates strategy, and it's not at all. This is people voters going up to the candidates saying, here's our agenda. We love your platform, but here's our agenda. Sign the dotted line, or else we'll go find another candidate who will sign the contract. And that's the candidate me and other people like me around this country are going to support. Only candidates who signed the contract for American Renewal. So those are the activists. And then the people, of course, who take this pledge, which is available on our website, are the third component. And we have a URL for each one of these components, right? So if you're a candidate and you're looking at you want to look at the contract and maybe sign it, or listen to a video explaining the advantages to the candidates of signing a contract like this, a contract with voters, it's http://CFAR 2018.us as in United States. Now, if you're an activist and you want to recruit candidates and you want to help or encourage people to sign the CFAR or else voter pledge, then you can use http://CFARmovement.us. That'll take us to the website. That used to be the Bernie or Bust website. And if you're a voter and you want to commit yourself to voting only for candidates who signed the contract for American Renewal, and I'll come back to this because it's an important component of this strategy, then you can use the http://CFARvoter.us as in the United States. Now, the purpose of the pledge, of the voter pledge, is to build numbers, right? This is a leverage strategy.
Yes.
We discovered leverage when we, between the time I stood on a street corner having a conversation in April 2015, and someone said, well, what about a write-in campaign to support Bernie Sanders? If he doesn't win the Democratic primaries, what about a write-in campaign? And I thought at the time that was brilliant. So between that time and when we actually launched the website in June of 2015, we came to realize that this is leverage. It's two kinds of leverage. It's leverage during the primaries to tell the voters, look, there's tens of thousands of people across the country who are taking this pledge. If you Democrats don't vote for Bernie Sanders in this primary, if he doesn't become the party nominee, you're going to lose in November because you've got people who won't vote for whoever the nominee is. And it wasn't never Hillary, right? It was never O'Malley. It was never Webb. It was never anyone else but Bernie. It was a commitment to revolution. It was a line in the sand. We are going to.
It was specifically Bernie or bust.
Right. We are going to support the progressive candidate, and we're not crossing this line. And this is what it's going to take. This is a militant electoral strategy, and I'm not going to argue it's the only thing that will solve the problem of too much money in politics and try to renew the democratic spirit in the United States. But it is a significant contribution to the electoral strategy that progressives can use. So, and that's it in a nutshell, right? Those are the three components that we're trying to build: a voter pledge, CFAR activists out there encouraging people to take that pledge, and encouraging candidates to sign the contract. And we have a tutorial page on our activist website. Again, that's CFARmovement.us. that people can watch the tutorial videos that we've created. We explain how to approach candidates to ask them, right? This is a process. I just want to touch on this very quickly. This is a process you go through. You don't start off saying, sign this or else. You start off saying, please, sign this. Look at all the advantages you can have to being a CFAR candidate over your opponents. Right, you're going to be able to use this thing as a cudgel during the debates to smack your opponents because they don't have the spine or the courage to make a binding commitment to the voters that they're going to go to Washington and do exactly what the voters want. And, yes. And I just need to make a point about that. This is a populist contract. Every one of the policy positions in the CFAR template is supported by polls indicating that a vast majority of Americans support that policy position. So you either make a commitment to your voters by signing this contract, or you're not going to have an advantage in your primary. That's stage one. Then if they hem and they haw and they won't sign, I'm going through this with a candidate in New York right now. I'm not going to name names, but she was on a conference call I was on a week ago, and she asked me a few questions, and then I reached out to her on Facebook messaging, and she said, well, we'll talk about it later. Then I said, well, I can send you this contract because we recently updated the contract to include some very important elements that we wanted. Some came from changes as a result of your conversation with our spokesperson, Kelly Lane. You had a few questions, and we realized that we had some gaps and we needed to strengthen the contract itself. So we made some changes there. And there's another very important change I want to get to after I talk about this process of getting a candidate to sign on. So today,
sure.
I emailed her a copy of an email that's going out now in support of a CFAR candidate right here in New York's 23rd District that I recruited. That was a lengthy process. We had 7 candidates locally. I had to go through all of them. They all turned me down. Then we tweaked the contract, made it a little less. We just took out the language instructing people to issue a class action lawsuit if this politician doesn't do what he or she says. We took out that language, and I went back through the list again, and Rick Gallant, a union leader and a school teacher, went ahead and signed the contract. So we have an email going out in support of him now, and I sent myself a sample just to make sure it was working okay first, and I forwarded that to her, and I said, here's kind of a type of thing we can do for you. And you can write this thing. You can compose this letter. We have a letter going out soon in support of Martha Squire, independent CFAR candidate for Senate in Michigan. She composed that letter. So we can coordinate, even though we have a PAC, we can coordinate as long as we don't run ads on television and the radio. But
she's running against Debbie Stab Me Now.
Stab you now, yeah.
Yeah.
So back to this strategy. So I emailed her and I said, here's what we can do for you. I'll send this out to all these people in New York State. And if you don't want to sign the contract, then I'll go and ask your opponent. And I actually looked up at Ballotopia, and I looked to see who's running in this congressional district, and I found the name of one of her opponents. And I used that name. I said, well, ask her if you don't want to sign it. Basically, now I'm at the stage with this candidate of or else. If you don't sign it, or else, do sign it, or else we'll ask one of your opponents to sign it. It's leverage, right? There's leverage built in this thing from beginning to end.
And I'll tell you, Victor, that's why I'm so enthusiastic about the process, okay, and the kind of thing that you're doing, because we have never had an accountability mechanism like this one inside of our politics, okay, American politics. And the absence of that may be exactly what has been wrong with American politics.
It's possible. This is unprecedented. I'll just make reference to the 2 closest things out there to what we're doing. The first, of course, was in 1994. Newt Gingrich and his buddies in Congress wrote the contract with America to unleash corporations and make America great, or whatever their slogan was. But it was a contract with America that those guys wrote. They were the minority party at the time, and after that election, because voters, they saw this contract, they said, yeah, these people really mean what they say, that they're committed to this agenda. So without even maybe caring that much about what the agenda was, they won. They actually took the majority position in the House for the first time in decades. My point here is contracts, candidate contracts work. They light up the public imagination, the voters' imagination, and it tells voters, hey, This is a candidate who's going to go to Washington and do what we, the people, want them to do. Not what the party bosses want them to do, not what the donors want them to do, but right here in black and white is a signed contract telling us they're going to do what we want them to do. So it's unprecedented that way. Contract with America was top down. CFAR, Contract for American Renewal, is bottom up. It's a grassroots strategy. And the second historical precept to this is the Norquist Pledge, right?
Yes,
very similar sort of thing. He's got, only it's a pledge. It's not a contract. It's just a pledge. But the Republicans, virtually all the Republicans, have taken that pledge, and they will not raise taxes. So there's two differences between the pledge and the contract. First, it's a pledge coming from a guy close to Republicans, close enough to the donors that he backs up his effort with a PAC and lots of money to spend on races to oppose the candidate. Our approach is grassroots. We have a PAC because it costs money to do these things, right? And you can only spend $999 of your own money before you're breaking the law, spending more than that to help candidates for Congress or president or whatever. So by law, we had to have a PAC. But we're not getting donations from the millionaires and billionaires to support these candidates. Instead, we're building a public support effort, what will hopefully become a movement in time.
Yes.
To support all CFAR candidates across the country. So in that sense, it's similar to the Norquist Pledge, except it's coming from the grassroots and it's not funded by millionaires and billionaires.
You're right. And it's not just a single thing. I will not raise taxes. It's an agenda.
Right. It's a populist agenda. Now, the contract itself is a template with 11 policy positions, and we discourage candidates from taking all 11, even if they support all 11, because not all voters support all 11. And what you don't want to have is a situation where a voter looks at the contract and says, wow, I was great right up to the 10th bullet point, and I just can't support that, so I'm not going to vote for you. Right? To explain this well, I need a Venn diagram, but the more issues you have, the smaller the overlap between all these various issues are.
Yes, I agree.
And you risk coming down below 50%, and you got to keep that above 50% in a general election in order to win office, in order to win the majority of voters and win office. Right. So we recommend candidates sign on to anywhere from 4 to 7 of these policy positions.
Okay.
So I have a kind of exciting announcement. Sunday, we signed our first incumbent. That was thrilling. This has been a very exciting weekend. We've had so many ups and downs. We've had website problems. It's been very depressing at times. Nothing seems to be moving. Nothing seems to be happening. But this week is one of the up weeks. Congressman Khanna in California became the first.
Khanna signed?
Khanna signed the contract for American Renewal, all 11 policy positions. So he's our first incumbent. He's also a Justice Democrat. And
right, so he was not afraid to sign on to all 11.
No, he embraced them all, which was kind of surprising. He tweaked one of them because there's a specific bill in Congress that he's supporting for free education, and he didn't want to be held accountable for something he doesn't support. So he made it very specific on that one policy position that he very specifically supports the Reich plan, which I think he means Robert Reich, and I'm not sure.
Yeah, Robert Reich, too. I think so, too.
But he's not a member of Congress, so I'm not sure. I guess he's got a bill in Congress for free education. Anyway, that's what we can hold him accountable to on that specific policy is that bill. But all the rest of all 10 of the rest, he signed right on to. And then the other one is another Justice Democrat. We have 3 Justice Democrats now. Is Rosa Calderon in California, also California. Oh. She's in California, 4th District, and she signed just a day or two ago. I'll be interviewing her, in fact, Saturday afternoon.
Cool.
To talk about the contract.
Okay, and you mentioned a third person too, didn't you?
The third Justice Democrat was the first one we got. It was Peter Jacob in New Jersey. Now, I had interviewed him. He ran in 2016. And at that time, on top of all the Burn Your Bust organizing that I was doing and keeping track of, I was also writing for the Progressive Examiner, which is a pro-am website that's no longer in business. And in that capacity, I was interviewing Bernie-crats all across the country, and a Bernie independent in California, San Francisco, running against Nancy Pelosi. I interviewed a whole bunch of these people, and Peter Jacob was one of them. So I had this relationship, this rapport established with him. He trusted me as a progressive, as somebody real and not a fraud, or questionable in any way. And I trusted him because I knew what the answers to my questions that I had asked him in 2016 were. So we had this rapport. We had a phone conversation, and then he went ahead and signed. So he was the first Justice Democrat. Ro Khanna was the second, and now Rosa Calderon is the third Justice Democrat. And we also have 66 CFAR volunteers who have signed up. So we update them on occasion. Here's how you approach these candidates. We offer them case studies, particularly Ro Khanna, because he's an incumbent. I did that on Twitter, which is surprising because I don't talk about what we did in 2016 very much. I refer to Citizens Against Plutocracy, which is the name of our website, the URL on our website, and our PAC is Citizens Against Plutocracy. I don't mention the fact that we were the ones who were doing the Burn Your Bust effort, right? Because I'm not sure how there's some people who might be offended by that. Oh my God, we have Donald Trump because of you people. Or, I just don't want to take that chance of putting that out there routinely. I will now because I know you already know this, and a lot of real progressives already know that Revolt Against Plutocracy, Citizens Against Plutocracy were the ones that organized the Burn Your Bust effort. But generally, I don't bring this up. However, on Twitter, which is where Burn Your Bust came from, on Twitter, I am Burn Your Bust. I am at Burn Your Bust. So here I am. That's where the slogan came from. After we launched the website in June of 2015, I said, well, I better join Twitter because, we're going to need to use that social media outlet. And we couldn't think of a Twitter handle. We couldn't think of a Twitter address to use. And I went back and forth with Revolt Against Plutocracy co-founder Patrick Walker, and he made a couple suggestions, which I tried, and they were already taken. And one late morning, he emails me and he says, I just saw this comment on a Bernie post on Facebook. Try Bernie or Bust. And lo and behold, this is early, maybe late June of 2015, that was available. So I snagged it. And at the time, the Burn Your Bust pledge wasn't called Burn Your Bust at all. That was the first we'd actually used it and heard that phrase. It was called the Wins Pledge. Right in November, Sanders, the Wins Pledge. And it wasn't a week after we acquired Burn Your Bust that Patrick and I both went, oh, this phrase is golden. Let's get rid of the Wins Pledge. Let's call this thing the Burn Your Bust Pledge. We changed it, language on the website. And the rest is history, as they say.
Okay, so you are really having substantial progress with the campaign at this point.
Yeah, lately it's been pretty exciting.
There are volunteers, and you're getting additional candidates that are signing on. So how many candidates do you have that are signed on at this point?
21, I believe, total. There's another one on our list. I'm not going to name names. He's a Green Party candidate. I've asked him for a more serious photograph. Right now, he's just standing in blue jeans and a T-shirt in front of his tent. and I said, you don't even have to shave, dude. Just get a nice photograph of yourself, and we'll put you up there on our website too. And until he conveys to me a certain kind of seriousness about wanting to win his election, I'm not going to include him. So it's 21, 22 candidates at this point. Our aim is to get at least something on the order of 50, 60, roughly one in each state. I think if we got more than that, if we actually had one in each congressional district, we'd be so overwhelmed with work, I would probably stroke out. Because that's, I have a full-time job. I come home, I take a quick nap to recharge the batteries, and I spend hours up here in my office working on this strategy and, getting interviews scheduled with Kelly Lane. She's handling the interviews with the candidates at this point. I'm going to help her a little bit with some of the lesser known candidates here to get caught up, because we're starting to recruit fast enough that we have more than we can schedule for interviews. Once we schedule for the interview, which gets live streamed to Facebook, then we upload that to YouTube and create a YouTube video that some candidates have used actually on their website, the short 15-minute discussion about the contract, how they're going to use the contract in their capacity as a candidate. And that's number one way to do it is stick this interview on your website. And we also just recently came up with a CFAR logo that we are hoping candidates will also put out, like on the front page of their website, the same way they are Justice Democrats or Brand New Congress.
That'd be great.
There's logos that there's Justice Democrats and Brand New Congress people have, and they're putting them on the websites. So we have another logo that will let voters know, oh, this is a CFAR candidate.
Oh, that's cool. Okay, very cool. Okay, so what is the current content of CFAR?
Well, I'm pretty excited about a change. I'm sure you'll readily understand why we ditched the two policy positions that called for an increase in taxes. Right? Why fight the Norquist pledge when you don't have to? That's one thing, and the other thing is they don't fund spending anyway, as people in Real Progressives readily understand by now. So why even bother having them on there? We had more important things to get on there, and Kelly was pushing strong for election reform. That there's an awful lot of concern that the electronic systems currently in use are very hackable.
Oh, I know. Fact, I share that concern.
Right.
I believe they are hackable and that they're hacked.
Right. There was a DEF CON 2017 conference. They brought in voting machines from all around the country. Every machine in that conference was hackable. Every one of them was hacked. There's no safe electronic voting machine in this country. So that's a real problem. The problem we had was we wanted to put something alluding to hand-counted paper ballots on the contract, but the contract is populist. So we had to find polling to support people not trusting the electronic voting system. So Kelly looked for weeks and weeks. She dug through all these websites that cover polls, like, I can't think, Gallup and all the rest of them, right? PPP.
Daily cost. Did you look at daily costs also?
I don't know what she looked at total, but she looked and looked and looked and couldn't find polling that supported us putting something like this on. And it was last week. We found it last week. I just stumbled into it. I was looking. I was on websites looking and Google searching, and I couldn't find anything. But on Twitter, I saw this reference to an article on The Hill by a Republican conservative making the case to Donald Trump that he should call for hand-counted paper ballots. And he made reference in that article to this poll. So I clicked on it because it was a hot link, and I found exactly what we were looking for. It was an Associated Press poll, very legitimate, indicating that 76% of the voters do not have either no confidence or little confidence that their vote will be counted and that the machines will not be hacked. Now, this is important because, first of all, this poll came from 2016. This poll came from before DEFCON 2017, before we found out all these machines are very hackable, provably hackable, and before this loud MSNBC, CNN, Russian hacked the election bogus narrative,
yeah, the Russia
which has a lot of people thinking, oh my God, the Russians are going to change the outcome of this election, hacking the voting machines, which is complete bullshit, pardon my French. It didn't happen, and it probably can't happen. But, again, if they're hackable, then who knows? But now there's got to be even more people who have little or no confidence that the votes will be counted properly.
Right. So, and there's also Tim Canova's lawsuit.
Right, but there's no data there. There's no data that tells us this is a populist position. So we knew about that, but we couldn't use that to rationalize putting hand-counted, a mandate for hand-counted paper ballots on the contract. It's now on the contract.
Oh, wonderful.
We haven't finalized the language yet, but it's on the contract. And once we finalize the language, then we'll convert all the contracts, because there's 4 versions of each contract. There's a House contract and a Senate contract. Yes. Each of them come in Word version, text version, JPEG version, and PDF. Right? Yes, so all this has to be completely redone that's 8 different documents that have to be modified, uploaded to Dropbox, and then the URLs have to get put on 2 different websites. So it's going to be a time-consuming process, but we're almost there, and that will be our final draw. And then, of course, just to follow up on the question you actually asked me, we changed one of the policy positions as a result of your question to Kelly when you interviewed her. You pointed out that on the infrastructure policy position, it just said that they have to spend a lot of money on infrastructure. There's no way to hold them accountable. I mean, what is a lot of money? As you said at the time, is Trump's infrastructure program good enough to be held accountable, supporting that? Or is there some specific amount that we want the candidates to request, right? And so the way we framed it now is we want the government to spend $2 trillion on infrastructure over 5 years, but because Congress and democracy involves this big compromise, it always does. So therefore, start out asking for $4 trillion over 5 years, and then compromise down to $2 trillion, so that we get enough to join the 21st century infrastructure-wise.
Sure. That's great.
So that's 2 of the policy positions. We also have overturning Citizens United. And there's a possibility, if we do this again in 2 years, that we'll actually use your idea that you brought up again in the conversation you had with Kelly about using the Constitution, which allows Congress to write a law and essentially tell the Supreme Court to butt out, right? Hands off. You can't touch this law. And therefore, Congress could actually enact comprehensive campaign finance reform, tag on that section, that article from the Constitution saying,
yes, it's Article 3, Section 2.
Right. Stay off this. You can't touch this law.
No, you don't have any jurisdiction.
You have no jurisdiction over this particular campaign finance matter. This is between us and the voters. Bug off. Stay out. And so that might be a way to approach overturning Citizens United. Instead of overturning the decision, you might be able to get around it, which might be clever and easier than amending the Constitution.
Okay, it actually overturns a decision, because once you tell them to butt out, they're not able to apply the initial decision they made. In other words, just doesn't apply anymore. So it overturns it in a true sense, but also it would not in itself be a permanent thing to do because it's just a law, okay, of Congress. So it's okay to go ahead with the broader strategy or the long-term strategy of trying to get a constitutional change passed, okay, an amendment. But that, of course, is a very long-term thing, 6 or 7 years, and we can't wait 6 or 7 or 10 years even. Okay, and we can't wait that long for that to happen.
Yeah, I think this is worth pursuing, and I will bring this up with the Move to Amend folks when we go to the UNRIG Summit here next weekend in New Orleans. We'll be making a presentation, Kelly, myself, and a colleague from Move to Amend that I organized with. He's based in New Mexico. The three of us are going to converge on that conference, and we'll be making a presentation on Sunday morning in the seminar room of a chapel next door to the building that this summit will be held in on Sunday morning at 9 o'clock, but basically presenting CFAR or else. So we're getting pretty excited about that, and we can actually bring this up with the Move to Amend people who will be at that summit.
Okay, that's going to be exciting. Okay, so but just to review the contract now, what are the items?
So we talked about overturning Citizens United. We talked about hand-counted paper ballots. We talked about infrastructure starting out at $4 trillion, and compromising at $2 trillion. Implementing bold measures to combat climate change. Now, we don't have specific numbers for this. How do you hold somebody accountable to this? It's a subjective thing. And we don't really want to use this contract to kick people out of office. Right? If they're doing anything to support laws to combat climate change, that's good enough. We're using this contract to get progressives elected, not to pull them out of office, unless it turns out they're frauds and they're not progressive at all, and they're not doing anything that they said they'd do on this contract, in which case the contract was written to challenge case law,
yes,
and possibly throw them out of office.
Yes,
so,
right.
I mean, that's the way the rest of the contract, not the 11 policy positions, but the rest of the contract was written to actually be enforceable. It is a binding contract, a legally binding contract, until a judge throws it out, in which case it's no longer legally binding. So those are a few of the positions.
With respect to this particular position, though, even though perhaps it's impractical to tie people down to specific figures on this, but certainly the people who signed the CFAR ought not to be voting for bills that allow expansion of the use of fossil fuels. In other words, they shouldn't be supporting any drilling bills. Okay.
Yeah, there's a comment by Mark Fabian who just said, we can sit there and monitor the votes these politicians take with regard to the environment. All right, and that's going to be up to their constituents. Like, there's Revolt Against Plutocracy is 5 people. We're not going to be able to keep an eye on all these candidates who we're going to help get elected this year. That's going to be up to the constituents and certainly people in Real Progressives to monitor these CFAR politicians and their behavior, and they'd better be fighting against these tax loopholes that these fossil fuel companies have, and any number of ways they can take bold measures to combat climate change. They can offer special reductions to alternative fuel companies, like zero federal corporate taxes if you're involved in renewable energies, windmills, and so forth. Another policy position, just to move on real quick here, is ending the war in Afghanistan. You think about this. I've thought about this policy position a lot. I've been a peace activist most of my life. I went to grad school to study war and peace and world politics. You know, during the Vietnam War, if there was a contract, a candidate's contract back then, and it only had one position, you must vote to pull out of Vietnam, that would have been huge at the time.
That would have been huge. That's right.
Right? And this is the same, this is just one of 11 policy positions that you know, you would think, and part of what the potential of this contract has is to pull together all these groups, move to amend for the Citizens United thing, Org 350, or I think is what it's called, 350.org for the climate change policy plank, the peace groups in support of the pulling out of Afghanistan, and other organizations, reform. I'm trying to think of the criminal reform. We have one of the policy positions we use to replace a tax increase is mandating a independent investigator on all lethal forms of law enforcement. Right? If a cop kills somebody, even if they strangle them or accidentally strangle themselves, you know, whatever the thing is in jail, whatever use of lethal force is employed by police, then bring in a special independent prosecutor, not these police investigators that are all buddy-buddy. So that's another one of the modifications we made from the original CFAR that was presented to us last year. We decided to get rid of one of the tax increases and replaced it with this mandate for independent investigators for all police use of violence. What else do we have here? Expand Social Security by lifting the cap on taxable income above $250,000 and then increasing benefits by at least 10% for all eligible recipients. You know, it's just Social Security is just not an awful lot of money. If you're living on just that, you almost can't get by. That and Medicare, it's just not enough as it stands
Yes,
today.
I know.
So we want to expand on the benefits, and I guess that's one of the remaining sort of, I wouldn't say hidden, but one of the remaining tax increases is just to increase that threshold which they can still tax income for the purposes of Social Security.
Okay, I guess I got a question. Okay, and that question is, since from our point of view, when I say our, I mean the RP point of view, well, we know that taxes do not fund spending, and that includes Social Security taxes. So, just as a political position, we would be in favor of increasing benefits on Social Security by 10% or by far more than 10% without actually increasing Social Security taxes at all. In fact, we would be in favor of just having Social Security funded by the Congress in a separate bill that did not mention any taxation at all, that simply guaranteed that the federal government would pay for Social Security, and that payment would come out of the general revenues of the federal government, or not, depending upon what the Congress decided. But the payment would still be guaranteed. The appropriation would still be made. And so the government would be responsible for making the payments and for spending the money. Okay, so I think that the kind of thing that we would have in mind would be to promise an increase in the benefits without saying anything about changes in taxable income at all.
Right. Well, so a couple of points about this. First of all, it wasn't written by anybody who knew jack about modern monetary theory. right? And even when it was presented to us, I didn't know much about modern monetary theory. So again, this is sort of a first run at this thing in 2018, this contract, and it wouldn't hurt to increase that threshold, that tax threshold, right? It would simply help income inequality to a certain extent. It's not important. I agree with you in terms of actually funding increases in. It was written by somebody who didn't know modern monetary theory, and he was still locked into that taxes fund spending mode.
Okay, let's leave MMT aside for the moment. Okay, and let's just consider okay, I don't see the necessity of explaining MMT here to people or to Congress people. What could be done is just to specify that they have to pledge to provide for an expansion of Social Security of a particular amount. Okay, and then one could discuss the funding or I shouldn't say the funding,
right?
The pay-fors, quote unquote, in some other context. Why do the candidates have to pledge to a particular pay-for? In let's say Ro Khanna's case, okay, I know he signed this, but at the same time, I also know that he knows MMT. So he knows taxes do not fund spending. Okay, so if he got into a tight situation where there was a choice between raising Social Security benefits, okay, and saying no to a raise in taxes to pay for that, then which way would he go? Okay, in other words, he knows what the truth is.
Well, I mean, that's the kind of decision he'd have to make. So let me just make another point about the entire contract as an agenda. It's not revolt against plutocracy's agenda. It's not Victor Tiffany's agenda. If it were me, the United States would be pulling out of the Middle East, not just Afghanistan, for example. This is a populist agenda. And everything on this contract is supported by polling that indicates voters would support such a move. So as far as we can actually, because we're still in the process of revising this contract, I can bring this to the committee. This is one thing about a committee working, I'm not working alone, I'm working with a committee. The good points about that is they keep me from making mistakes, policy mistakes and so forth. And the bad thing about that is when we have some sort of revision like this that we need to consider for something like a contract, which is our big deal right now, I need to bring this up for a vote, right? This will be another change to the contract that will have to go before the committee and basically cut that first part of that contract or that policy position out. Forget the increase of taxes, just increase Social Security benefits 10%. So why not 20%? Why not 50%? Because polling doesn't support that. This is a populist agenda, not necessarily a progressive agenda, right? So this isn't real progressive's agenda. This comes from the people.
Okay,
and that is its strength.
Okay, I understand that, and I realize that's an element, okay, of strength
and limitation.
Okay, and I certainly think that if someone wanted to increase Social Security benefits by 10%, we certainly would not oppose that. Now, we would fight very, very hard for more than the 10%. Okay, but if someone were to pledge to at least 10%, we wouldn't be holding that against them, okay, especially since that person would be perfectly free to advocate in their district for 50% or for 60%, okay, or for some other figure they favored. Okay?
Right. They can change the contract this way. The contract is a template. It's just a negotiating tool. So
Yes,
if a candidate might want to come up and say, well, I'm only going to support 5% increase. And the leverage or the CFAR activists that we've recruited have it within their power to say, that's not enough. You either eliminate that as a policy position on the contract altogether, or it must be 10%. Right? This is a negotiation that's going on.
Right. Okay, I understand. And that's a very good point. Okay, let's go for a minute before coming back to Social Security to the other taxing measures that you had in the bill. You had a measure to establish a progressive estate tax
on
the top 0.3% of Americans. Was there no polling? Was there no polling to support that?
No, there was polling to support that. We just didn't want to add more and more policy positions to the contract. We wanted to keep it at 11. So when we added the hand-counted paper ballots, we had to take something out. So we took out a tax increase. And when we added mandating assignment of special independent prosecutor, we had to take something out. So we took out a tax increase. So the only tax
increase on the top 1% of earners.
Just the lifting the cap on taxable income above $250,000 for Social Security purposes. That's the only one that remains at this point. You're looking at an old version of the contract. I'm looking at the one that we're going to be publishing and presenting.
Right, but the point I'm making is that most probably our RP people would have supported a progressive estate tax and also the increase on the income tax rates on the top 1% on grounds of inequality and doing something about inequality. That would probably be fairly easy to justify to our people. I'm speculating about this. I don't really know. Okay, I don't have a poll, but I'm just sort of suggesting that. Okay, but with respect to the Social Security, that is very hard for us to take, and the reason why it is that the issue of Social Security has come up time and time again, and the right wing, okay, and the austerity people are always giving the narrative that whatever increase in Social Security occurs has to be paid for. And also they come with the narrative that if there's not enough money in the Social Security fund, the trust fund, that the payments then could not be fully made, so that they're projecting all the time that the government is going to run out of money to pay for Social Security in 2033 because the trust fund will have gone down to zero, and current taxes at that time, according to their models, will not be able to fully cover the payments. And we have been at pains to argue, some of us, including myself, for years, that the trust fund doesn't have a damn thing to do with actually funding Social Security. The only thing that matters in funding Social Security is the appropriations, okay, of Congress, and the obligation of the executive branch to spend those appropriations. Okay? And that the trust fund is not really involved. It's always up to a decision of the Congress. Okay, and then there are various other narratives that come in there, like the narrative of the platinum coin, and also the proposal to fund spending, that I recently made, simply by Congress forcing the Fed to place the funds for spending into the Treasury spending account. And okay, so from the standpoint of our narrative, which is really core to our existence, I think, we're very serious about the idea that people not receive the impression, and that the Congress candidates that we are supporting do not give the impression that Social Security taxes are in any way paying for Social Security. We don't want to reinforce that as a political narrative. In other words, we think that narrative is poison. Okay, now we don't mind. In fact, we like the narrative that the reason why you tax people is to do something about inequality or to discourage particular behaviors. We fully agree with that narrative, but we don't want to be involved in supporting the other narrative that there is any way in which taxes are actually paying for Social Security, especially that, because that has stood in the way of increasing Social Security payments for so many years now. It's just a crime, and we don't want our people involved in that crime anymore.
No, I understand that, and again, we changed this contract from as a consequence of your conversation with Kelly Lane when you interviewed her about this a while back. It led us to change some of these just to refine it slightly, put numbers in there so we can hold people accountable.
You're right, and I think you did a very
and we
good
can
job
do it
of
again, and we can do it again, specifically with this step on raising the cap on Social Security taxes. And I agree with you 100%. One of the taxes we took out really had less to do with funding the government than it did with discouraging a specific behavior, which is high-speed trading, right? People stick their computers in between the order to buy and the actual sale, right? They stick a computer in there, and every time there's a buy or sell of stock on the market, they make a quarter of a penny or a tenth of a cent, and of course that adds up. And so it's just stupid people. I don't mean stupid people. It's a stupid process of people are just getting in there and making money off a process that they have no business to be making money from. Right? Go out there and earn your money like the rest of the people. Invest it.
Go out there and earn your money like a man.
Yeah, don't let the computers do it. So and so that was one of the tax increases we took out, and it wasn't. So we agree with you. We want some taxes used to modify behavior, and that was one of them. So there are other purposes to taxes besides funding the government, and that's one reason why we would probably want to go back in 2 years and add some of these tax increases. Let me just move ahead to the other points because there's only a few left. Increasing minimum wage to $15 an hour. One thing we did with that was move it from the very top to the very bottom. And the reason we did that is to make it look less progressive. All right. And now, why do we want to do that? We think of this as a populist agenda, not a progressive agenda. And the reason has to do with framing. Right. If you listen to George Lakoff, words can hurt you. And you pick any political word, whether it's Tea Party, liberal, conservative, progressive, none of these ideologies are supported by a majority of Americans. None of them. Right? They're all minority, backed by a minority of Americans. So drop the language. That's what we chose to do. Is instead of initially we were thinking along the lines that this is going to be called progressive or bust, right? That was our thinking. That we would come back after Bernie or bust and do progressive or bust. And one of the things I was having a hard time trying to figure out was, how are we going to get all these dozens, maybe hundreds of volunteers around the country to determine who's progressive and who isn't? Because you had Hillary Clinton out there saying over and over again, I'm a progressive, as if Joseph Goebbels had risen from the dead, joined her campaign as a policy advisor. Yes, just keep repeating that big lie. And so how do you deal with that? And this contract came along, and it was a gift from heaven. It's like, oh my goodness, this answers that question. We don't have to go through all that crap anymore. We don't have to find out who's funding these candidates. We don't have to believe them when they say they're progressive. All we have to do is get them to sign the dotted line. They sign the dotted line. They're committed to this populist policy agenda, and they're in. Not necessarily progressive per se, but they will do the will of the people, and these are left-leaning, like the American people. They're left-leaning policy proposals. So this solves that problem.
I see this, and I also see that it may make some sense to avoid the labels.
We try.
Okay, I take
you guys want to change
way,
the name of, you guys want to change the name of real progressives to real populists. That would be great.
Okay, I don't think we would, but the way I look at issues like this is, I think the way Bernie looked at it. He got tagged very, very early on as being a socialist.
He's called himself a socialist all of his career.
Right. So somewhere along the line, very early in his career, he decided to forget about it and call himself a socialist. And when he was charged with being a socialist, what he would basically say is, yes, I'm a socialist, but here's what I'm for. And do you agree with me? And he would ask people whether they agreed with him or not, whether they were for the policy positions.
Right.
So I suppose what we would say in reply to what you said about that is that, first of all, we could confess to actually being progressives and being populists, actually being both. And we could say, but forget about those labels. How do you like our policies?
Right. How do you like the contract?
Yes. How do you like the policies? And the next thing, okay, that I would say is that the raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour that people are contracting to do, first of all, it doesn't say to at least $15 per hour. So it doesn't leave room for a candidate to advocate, say, like Winfield would do, for $20 an hour. Because
remember, they can change this. They can add, they can modify it. It's a negotiation, and so if they want to make it better, the only thing we ask them is to make sure whatever changes they make, that they're supported by a large majority of voters. So it is top to bottom a populist document and agenda.
Okay, I think that's a good point. Okay, we have a lot of sentiment, okay, in our group, which I've seen in many comments here. Like from Mark Fabian has a comment on the screen now.
Yeah, I saw that.
He said $15 an hour is still a subsistence wage in his city. Okay, it's not a living wage.
In any city.
Okay, and you're right. And we are for a job guarantee at a living wage. So the point being that we would like to see a living wage. We think $15 an hour is kind of passé now, because when you first started hearing $15 an hour, it was when? In 2011, 2012. It's now 2018.
Right.
Okay, it should no longer be $15 an hour. In fact, it is no longer $15 an hour. It is 18 or 20 or 22 or somewhere in
Joe,
there.
find polls that show us a majority of Americans support that will increase it. That's the sticking point for any of these modifications for us, is that it's a populist document, and we're sticklers for that. We absolutely find the strength of this document that it's populist. So
okay, so let me tell you.
We agree with you. We agree with you.
Let me
$20 an hour.
tell you. Okay, so let me tell you, or express something that I kind of think that that you know, but which I, as a social scientist, as a political scientist in particular, who studied polling, am very well aware of, and that is, when you poll, you get the answers that in one way or another your poll calls for.
Right.
If you don't include a choice in a poll of $20 an hour or $25 an hour, then you won't get a poll that gives you any data on how many people support $20 an hour or $25 an hour. And the polls, of course, are paid for by many of the same people who, in one way or another, influence and control the Congress. And there may not be a lot of money out there for polls that include $20 an hour or $25 an hour as a choice, but that doesn't mean that a populist agenda would not be supported by most of the people if it offered $20 an hour or $25 an hour. And I agree, one can't find a poll for it now, but I mean, it seems very plausible to me that if $15 an hour became popular in 2011, that the thing that would be popular in 2018 is somewhere above that.
I agree. I agree. It's just that we are pretty much handcuffed by polls at this point.
I don't know if you're handcuffed, okay, by polls. I think you've chosen to be handcuffed by polls.
We have.
Okay, and I think
I didn't say we were handcuffed. I said we are handcuffed, and it's our choice to be. Yeah.
Okay, and I'm not saying there shouldn't be. I think what I am saying is that there should be exceptions to that choice when it's fairly obvious to us, or to certain of the candidates. I don't know. Perhaps give the candidates a choice, starting at maybe $15 an hour, but seeing what they think about it in their particular districts. Okay?
Yeah,
I think if a
they
candidate
have that flexibility, they do have that flexibility. I'm not going to, if anybody says I got to make it $18 an hour, $20 an hour, I wouldn't want one of our activists to say no, it's got to be 15. Because that would probably be very populist too. I want to speak to a comment that I saw popping up here from
Sure.
one of the people, which is the neoliberals are not going to like this.
Well, they're not supposed to like it. It's a populist agenda.
CFAR or else is more than that. It is a war on neoliberals, right? Let me just go through the 4 objectives of this whole policy, rather than covering the last couple of policy positions. We have 4 objectives. 1, get CFAR candidates elected to Congress, right? Get these populists elected who will do something about these problems, Citizens United, campaign finance, et cetera, et cetera. 2, if they lose their primaries, the whole idea of a voter pledge is to make sure that the neoliberal who won the primaries loses the race against the Republicans. Yeah, this is a war against neoliberal Democrats. 3, as you pointed out at length in the first interview with Callie and then a little bit here, this is about holding these CFAR politicians who are elected accountable. Right? And then there's one more objective, which is kind of subtle. And it's like, all right, so what's this good for? We're building a list. Remember, this is a voter pledge And people can build this list using their own form, their own Google form that in their congressional district, they build a list of people who support this contract. So they end up with a list of people who are allies for fighting for legislation, fighting against legislation, supporting candidates for Congress, right? We're building a movement. This is a revolution. So one of the things that these lists do for us, activists who have our own list, and then we're going to have a national list. The Bernie or Bust list is broken down by state, and now we're building a more sophisticated list, which is broken down by congressional district, because we didn't go into this 2 years ago thinking that we could use this for what we're using it for now. So the next time around, we'll actually have more refined lists. It'll be smaller, but they'll be based on congressional district, and activists can call on these people to do things going forward to help transform the United States. And someone also wrote a note that I want to speak to, make the world great again. We're calling for something really big here, which is the reformation of this country, an American Reformation. You've heard of the Protestant Reformation? Our objective is nothing less than an American Reformation. So we're not thinking small. We're not thinking about little, a policy position, a pledge. We're talking about transforming the United States into a democratic order for the first time. We're talking about transforming the United States into something that's closer
I agree with you on that what you're doing here, if you can institutionalize this so that it operates in each one of the elections, national, state, and local, and you create that kind of accountability for the legislators, you will be transforming and creating a true democracy here in America. It's that important. It is visionary, and it is big. Okay. But there are still important issues about the content of what you support. Okay, and so Lynn Dufour made two comments, that I want to call attention to. She pointed out that Social Security taxes, not SS taxes, but SS is paid for out of the general fund, in fact. Okay, that in other words, Treasury writes the checks out of the Treasury spending account. And she's quite right. Okay, that's what happens. And we also know that the way money actually gets into the Treasury spending account is by the Fed creating it out of thin air. So we know that's actually what happens.
It sounds crazy.
And Ben Bernanke knew that too, and Alan Greenspan knew that too. They all knew and all know that that is true.
And somehow they managed to keep it secret until someone like Warren Moser come along and said, "Hey, look at what's going on here."
Yeah.
Right?
You're right. Okay, so Lynn goes further, and she said somewhere, I don't have exactly the comment up here, okay, and she said all she's interested in is that the contract acknowledge MMT. Okay, now, I don't feel the same way, and the reason why I don't feel the same way is that MMT is not a policy measure. It's an approach to economics, and the language of this contract has to be restricted to policy measures. Okay. Okay,
Yeah,
so I don't agree with her about that, but
we're letting the candidates themselves come up with how they're going to fund this, right? One of our questions that we ask the candidates, and this is a setup, one of the questions we ask the candidates every time we do the CFAR interviews is, we point out that there's some big ticket, expensive items, free college, Medicare for all, infrastructure. This is going to be expensive. What are you, a tax and spend liberal? And the reason we ask that question is not that we care about the answer, because it tells us, does this person need to find out about MMT, or does this person already know about MMT? So we're actually building it into the process, but it's in the background at this point. And what we hope to do, in cooperation with you and maybe Congressman Khanna, who knows MMT, or perhaps I believe Tim Canova also knows it. He's a CFAR candidate.
Yeah, I think that Tim probably knows it even better than Congressman Khanna.
Right. So what we're hoping to do is sort of this learning session with you and Tim Canova and two CFAR candidates who don't really understand MMT, and just have a sort of round table where you and Tim discuss it and explain it, and then they ask you two questions. One question might be to Tim: how are you going to describe this to voters without sounding like you're mad? And I don't mean angry, I mean insane, right? Because MMT itself is really simple to understand. The hard part is forgetting all this stuff we think we know about political economics, which is wrong, right? That's the hard part about MMT, is forgetting all the theories and understandings that we've had, that taxes fund spending and everything. There's a trade-off between guns and butter, and these crazy Republicans who want a balanced budget amendment, right? Because, oh my God, we're spending more than we're taking in. All these just totally obsolete gold standard type thinkings need to be forgotten. And that's the hard part for not just some of us maybe listening in on this conversation, but for voters who are going to be part of this debate. You're going to have Republicans accusing CFAR candidates of being irresponsible on budgets. And so one of the questions that Tim or you might get asked is, how do you defend this? How do you explain this to voters in a nice, simple way they can understand? And I don't want the answer to that question right now, but that's the kind of video seminar I think real progressives have the capacity and the instruments and the knowledge to record, right? And then once we have that recorded, we can present it as a YouTube video to all the CFAR candidates, and they'll be able to answer that question going forward. I'm neither a liberal and nor am I a taxer, right? They can go on and elaborate on that at that point. Okay,
but for now, what I want to do is to try to explain to you how simple it could be, and I think I can do that in 2 or 3 minutes. So the conversation with voters in a town hall meeting has to go something like this. The congressman or the senatorial candidate gives the CFAR, and somebody comes up, just as you did, with the question, which is basically, boy, there's a lot of spending here. How are you going to pay for it? Okay, and then all a congressman or senator has to do is to refer to a condensation of the 2 simple clauses that I put up on the screen that can be added to all of the appropriations bills, and explain to people that that will pay for it under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, because Congress will order the Fed to place the money into the Treasury account, into their spending account, okay, and that we're going to pay for it. Now, that can be done in 5 minutes, and then the congressman or senator can shut up until the next question comes. Now, that next question may never come, but that question may come in something like the form Well, what about taxes? And then the congressperson or senator can reply and say, well, we are going to have to pass some taxing bills, okay, because taxing, of course, is necessary for certain purposes, in particular for giving value to the currency. Okay? And so we will have to take up some taxes, but spending is a separate process from taxing. What taxing does is drain money out of the private sector so we don't get any inflation.
Right.
Okay. And what spending does, okay, is to spend into the private sector to accomplish the public purpose and to create good things for you, like the things that I outlined in my program.
To promote the general welfare.
Yeah, to promote the general welfare, or as we like to say, create the public purpose. Okay, so that's really all that has to be said. And then, of course, the congressperson can follow up and say, so when I'm in Congress, I'm going to do this with all spending and appropriations bills. And then I'm going to worry about the taxing when we come into the taxing bills. And then we'll decide how much we have to tax. And it won't be specifically tied to this bill or to that bill or to any particular set of bills. We will figure out what kind of taxing is appropriate that we need for the economy, for the private sector, keeping in mind that we don't want to tax the private sector too much, because too much taxation for the private sector drains money out of the private sector. And we're not attempting to do that here. We're attempting to add to the net financial assets of the private sector. And then we leave it at that. And where are they? I mean, what can they say? I know some of them are going to say, it's inflation, it's inflation. But we have ready answers to that. We always won that argument in the past. We run that argument right up through the middle 1970s until we hit the oil inflation. But when it was just jobs versus inflation, or prosperity versus inflation, we always won that argument against the Republicans. It was never a problem then, and it would not be a problem again. Once we get rid of this fucking pay-go stuff that they put into Congress a long time ago, which this reform would get rid of.
Right.
So that's the way I would explain it. I think it's pretty simple and that it can be explained in a town hall.
Yeah, and I just think the easy way to approach this, it would be, again, just to have you and Tim Canova and a couple of other CFAR candidates in a Zoom meeting where that can be, hit the record button, lay it out there, do this explanation, put this graphic up, and then take a few questions and answers from the CFAR candidates who might be still stuck in the old thinking, to help them get through this, out of that thinking and into the modern monetary way of understanding the economy. And then whether it's 15 minutes long or 30 minutes long or 50 minutes long, make it an educational session so that we can actually have the candidates talking about, without maybe using the phrase modern monetary theory, talking about overt congressional financing, for example, right? And really just address this whole issue of taxing and spending in a modern monetary theory without using that phrase, and to help real progressives teach the public about this modern, what I call modern monetary reality.
Okay, I think that might be the way to go. What I'd also like to point out is that if this language were included in the appropriations bills, then we would make it entirely obvious that taxes do not fund spending. Because no one could make a mistake that they do fund spending once they've read this. There's no taxation mentioned anywhere in there.
Right.
So that's an important advantage from an MMT point of view without even mentioning MMT. And then the second point that I would make about this is when the conservatives come at the congressperson, okay, or the senatorial candidate and say, well, what about the deficit and what about the debt? Well, this language ends the debt.
Right.
So
yeah,
what
it took me a while to wrap my head
about?
around that. I had to actually read this a few times before I realized what it was you were doing with this. You're right. It doesn't. It eliminates that whole question of, oh my God, you're passing the debt along to our grandchildren. No, we're paying it off.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. So if a conservative makes that kind of objection, then the answer is, well, what are you complaining about? I mean, it ends the debt. You've been screaming for that for years and years and years. Well, here it is. It ends the debt. So what are you complaining about? So
Yep. Powerful stuff.
Okay, so I think we've probably covered the hell out of this now, and we are somewhere. Okay, I'm into one of my marathons again, which I promised I would not do.
Yeah, I think this is gonna be worth sharing with some people. I'm thinking specifically of Steve Hilton. He runs and hosts the only program on Fox News that's actually worth watching these days, called The Next Revolution. And his populism is pretty much a right-wing populism. But he had a congressman on last Sunday talking about the balanced budget amendment. And I'm sitting there, no. So I'm hoping maybe I can get him to watch this and learn, and maybe bring somebody from Real Progressives, yourself, or somebody on his show, and start explaining that the next revolution is going to be a revolution in taxing and funding.
Okay. So thank you, Victor. Hey, I think it may be time to say goodnight for now.
Well, I appreciate this. It's a great opportunity to help people understand what this strategy is about, what we're trying to accomplish, the parts of it. We encourage people to go to cfarmovement.us, register to become a CFAR activist, and we will get you plugged in. We will show you and teach you how to do every step of the way, and we are going to change this country and create an American Reformation.
Okay, and what I'd like to say is I love that aspect of it. I love these new changes, okay, that you've made to the contract. I think those are, really excellent changes. Okay, and of course, I would hope for a few more changes, okay, as I've indicated here, but I understand that you have to talk to people about that. And so I think that I'm really very pleased with the session that we just had, and I look forward to a lot more sessions.
Me too.
Soon.
Well, thanks again for having me, and I hope you have a good night.
Okay, and you too, Victor. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, it's kind of hard to end this. Okay, I'm trying, but sometimes be live.